Okay, let's look at long-term savings. Let's look at products that we use. I buy my new iPhone. I buy a steak down at a restaurant. I buy a new car. I put an extension on my house. Whatever it is I spend money on. I buy a new bit of clothing. Okay. Product price is always going to be made up of three things: rent on land, profit on capital, and wages going to the labor content of whatever it is. My woolly jumper that I'm wearing. Okay. Part of it, when I buy it down, department store or what have you, is the wages of the people that have actually made it and got it to me. Part of it is the profit on the businesses that are involved in actually making and distributing the thing. And then, of course, there's rents involved in paying for the raw materials and the rent for the shops and whatnot. Okay, so that's the way that works: rent on land, profit on business returns, wages on labor. Okay, so the product price is made up of those three things. That actually reduces because profits on capital is split, because when you think about land, labor, and capital, again, this is a basic economics concept, comes from Adam Smith largely, although he actually plagiarized the French to get land, labor, and capital, but he plagiarized the French for a lot of things, uh, which the French don't like and the English don't talk about. But anyway, capital, tools, factories, whatever they are, ultimately you can break them into land and labor. Okay. I build a house, that's a capital item. Or build a factory, that's a capital item. Okay. The raw materials in the factory, ultimately they come from the land. And turning a bunch of building materials into a factory requires a lot of labor. Okay. So what we can do is break that into wages and rent. Capital actually disappears because it's always a function, a collection, a construct of rent and wages. So far, so good. Now, in an earlier slide, we looked at the way that savings, where does savings come from? Does savings come out of wages? We've said no, it doesn't, because wages, because of the way that land works, will always have the rents so high that they leave wages at subsistence, and so people aren't going to be saving out of that. All savings comes out of land rents. Okay, and so we've got wages, rent going to the landlord, and the landlord's also putting a bit of stuff aside to go and buy himself some more land or other income producing assets. That's the way that works. Now, if the products, let's say the woolly jumpers that are being produced, okay, they're going to be worn by people, and so that might be people that earn their income from wages. Okay. So they might go out and be able to buy themselves woolly jumpers, the product of this process. Also, landlords, to a certain extent, like to a certain level of landlord, they might need woolly jumpers, but they're not going to spend all of their land rents, all of their income on woolly jumpers. But the woolly jumpers are there because of everything that's going on inside this yellow edged box. And so on one hand, everything that's going on is what causes the woolly jumpers to be made. But then people aren't spending all that they make out of that productive effort. And so at the end of the production cycle, this is a bit of a tricky one to get across, but if there's, let's say, I don't know, $1,000 worth of woolly jumpers made, and they've got to be purchased by the community that makes it. If a tenth of the $1,000 is being taken off in savings, it means there's only $900 available to buy jumpers, and yet there's $1,000 worth of jumpers being made. That means that we're not going to be able to clear the market, because we needed the $1,000 to buy up the $1,000 worth of jumpers, but some landlord has put $100 into his bank account, and so that money is not available. So at the end of the first production cycle, 10% of the woolly jumpers aren't purchased. Now, I'm using woolly jumpers, but I'm really looking at the economy as a whole. So it's all of the food, clothing, shelter, and anything else that we do, our telephone sort of sanitizers and, I don't know, sort of massage kind of people, whatever it is, all of the goods and services. Out of all the goods and services that are made as a result of this process, not all of them are going to be able to be purchased because the money is not going back into the economy. This is the paradox of thrift that you're probably more likely to remember from your economic studies. Okay, and it is a genuine problem. Insufficient current purchasing power to clear the market. It means overproduction. Whoa, hang on. Oh, well, okay, we'll keep on going. It means overproduction. Overproduction, if you read economic history, the Great Depression that was happening pretty much a century ago, 1929, Great Depression. When I studied economics, I was told about the way it was overproduction was really the cause of the Great Depression. Overproduction, dreadful thing. People were making too much stuff. And that's what I learned. I dutifully, filled out my exam papers and said overproduction, really bad thing, and it caused the Great Depression. Okay. But the reality was something a bit more complex. The reality was not that there was too much stuff being made, it was too little stuff was being purchased. And the reason was that out of that $1,000, there's only $900 available for purchasing because people couldn't be bothered using their last $100 on consumption. We went into savings because their income was high enough that they could afford to do that sort of thing. Good on them. But it actually causes markets not to clear, again, to use an economics term. What happens then? Well, overproduction, so-called, underconsumption, is actually a problem which exists very much in our part of history. You only have to look at what's happening with electric cars. Apart from the stupidity of the technology, a lot of them are getting piled up in very unusual places for no particular reason. A lot of them simply aren't getting sold in the first place. And the same with regular petrol cars as well, for that matter. We're producing, or we have been known to produce, although we're solving it in a different way, a very unfortunate way. We were making too much food at one stage. There are certain very prominent people, mainly some associated with big names in computing, who are going out of their way to shut down our rural production. Overproduction. It's a current global problem. How do we solve that? If you've got this cycle where you've got enough wealth polarization that you've got some people in the community who simply don't spend very much of their money. I mean, if I was making, I don't know, I'm a modest kind of fellow. I reckon I'd have trouble spending $1 million a year if my income was up around that level. Although there are many people that are actually on salaries of higher than that. You might be able to spend $300,000 or $400,000 a year on a comfortable lifestyle, maybe $500,000 if you lived really, really well. But the other $500,000, if you're on a $1 million salary, you save. And that means you're not spending it. And if you're not spending it, it means that some part of the productive system, which is a closed cycle, is in overproduction because you're under-consuming. And that is a major problem. Again, not a lot of people like to talk about it, but it is growing as a major problem. Effects. Okay, I'll just put these up. Trade cycles isn't a tricky one. I won't be able to go too far into that, but if you want to understand business cycles, and while we have the 50-year cycle and the 20-year kitchen cycle and the 8 to 10-year property cycle and so on, a lot of it has to do because of this process. It does discourage production, but we still produce anyway. Now, the solutions are the things which are interesting. Okay. One is if I've got savings, you see, I put it into the bank, and the bank can then lend it to you, because you're on wages and I'm an entrepreneur
That
or
is
whatever you know.
interesting.
What's that?
That is very interesting because that's exactly what we've lived through in the last 20 or 30 years.
Yep, you're seeing it. I
Yeah.
I I wish I recorded it, but during the middle of the GFC, which it's probably a lot of folks in the class probably won't remember, or at least won't have been very interested personally in the global financial crisis around the mid 2000s. The senior economist of Standard and Poor's, the big company that is very, very important in financial markets and, basically the risk assessment on countries and all that sort of stuff. Chief economist in the middle of the GFC, when everyone was looking very gloomy, on national television in the United States, said to America, he says, well, the economy will be back on the rails once we get back into the habit of living beyond our means. And I'm watching this thing. This is like in television. I saw this. And I think, you're a goose. I mean, obviously, he's on one of these people who'd be on the multi-million-dollar salary packages. And he's telling the developed world to live beyond their means. That's how we got out of the GFC. Hasn't been a very happy story since. And Sandra, I think you're onto it. Okay, encourage debt. Exactly right. We can sell to new markets. Oddly enough, this is a solution that worked for a big part of the British Empire. The Brits basically turned the planet into a slave state. There were people working like slaves in India, in Fiji, and in the colonies, and they wanted to do it in Australia, but they couldn't quite pull it off. Selling to new markets. Right? The production was done by slaves, and then the sales at the end were selling into new markets. And so they were wanting to find more and more people that they could find anywhere on the planet. In fact, one of the reasons that the Brits had trouble selling into Europe was that Europe didn't believe in quasi-slave labor to make stuff, because the Brits were indentured labor in the colonies, India primarily, but many other parts of the world. And they were then selling into Europe because Europe had high wage rates. India had very low wage rates. And so they all had the Brits, they couldn't sell to their Indian, colonists and stuff. They had to sell into Europe. And so to break into these new markets. The Europeans didn't like it because they could see that the British were selling, like, especially textiles, into Europe, undercutting the Europeans who didn't believe in any of this stuff. I think we'll run out of time before I go too far into that. But that's basically how the British supported their empire. It's one of the reasons. Well, I said one of the reasons for the First World War. That's a story for another time that those of you interested can go and look up. This encouraging debt.
Garrick,
Yep.
that happened in Australia, that we were encouraged into new markets. I can't remember the time frame now. I've got it on a graph with Japan. Became one of our biggest trading markets.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I can't just remember the date, but it was what I learned after I watched that Elizabeth Warren lecture, and I went and had a look. And about the time um, all of our introductions that made us start to spend more money happened, we were also starting to really increase our trade with other parts of the world, but the biggest one was actually Japan.
Yep. 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 100%. And you see, it worked because of the situation the Japanese had, that they were rapidly sort of basically destroying in their own backyards. Yep. Uh, Korea had a similar kind of phenomenon, a little bit different. Other parts of Asia, it's quite fascinating once you start to see this stuff as it really is. Um, I'll just get on to the third because I'm just thinking we're running out of time, and I've had your attention for a long time now. I hope you're finding this stuff interesting. The solution, oddly enough, is to redistribute land. Right? Now, if you unpack some of the ideas that I've been putting in earlier on in the class, you would have seen that land concentrates because of savings, because land is the ultimate, investment asset. And as land then concentrates as a result of people save, therefore they buy more land. And if they buy more land, it's like the way that now our home ownership level is falling, right? What that means is if I get myself a investment property, like another house, okay, that means that there's somebody in Australia who's now paying rent who previously might have owned their own house. And if I get a second investment property, or a third or a fourth, and the average in Australia, or at least it was a few years ago, if I own an investment property, that puts me in a particular class of Australians. You know the average number of investment properties Australians own? If I own, if I'm an Australian who can say, yes, I've got an investment property, okay, and I get together down the pub with a whole lot of other people who are just the same kind of league, right? They've all got investment properties. On average, if I'm in that class, I will own 8 properties, 8 houses, 8 home units, whatever it's going to be. Okay. Which means that Small's there with his house he lives in, and there are 8 people who are paying rent to me who don't have the income and the potential to be able to own their own houses. They're going to be paying me rent, making me more wealthy. I'm not going to be consuming that money. And that then concentrates wealth more because then I'll use that 8 investment properties to buy another, handful or whatever. And I'm going on to being a major investment guru, whatever it's going to be. Right? Now, the opposite is to redistribute land. Now, I mentioned Japan actually got its head start immediately after the war because their land was redistributed. Because you see, the Japanese landlords, they weren't spending all of their income. They were using it for all sorts of things, but they weren't using it. They weren't using it for spending, and so they were causing the underconsumption. But by redistributing the land, which is what the Americans did after the war, they actually provide this fantastic economic stimulus to Japan because all of a sudden they got rid of the underconsumption, right? Because the average little rice paddy farmer had all of the income from his rice paddy production in his pocket. He was able to spend to buy a new pair of shoes or, buy a new roof for his house or whatever it's going to be. So the underconsumption disappeared. So the redistribution of land is an extremely powerful way of solving this cyclical problem of overproduction or underconsumption. Okay, I'll just go on. I'll just see what we've got. Yeah, okay. I just want to finish this slide. Now, I personally detest revolutions, right? I'm not at all a fan of the revolution that brought in the USSR back, a bit over a century ago. I now read too much to have the French Revolution as one of my glory moments in Western history. And every time you find a revolution, they're bad. But it is certainly redistribution of land is really quite a change. Revolution doesn't necessarily mean, Che Guevara sort of coming in and bringing in the communists or something. It simply means a major change in the way things are done. What happened in Japan was a revolution, but it was extremely peaceful, and it was done in order to actually improve things. Taiwan did something similar. They actually did it on their own volition. They actually decided to unravel the old feudal arrangements because they weren't working anymore. And that's one of the reasons why Taiwan has been the quiet achiever for so many years. It was a little bit less spectacular than Japan. Oh, it's still been very, very important. Um, but it's done really, really well because of the widely distributed land ownership. Again, the widely distributed land ownership in these countries has helped the free market, has helped the entrepreneurs and so on, because it's sort of taken the weight of land rents off their shoulders and enabled them to be far more productive. And being more productive, it means they're able to spend more into the economy, and that stimulates the economy, and everyone's standard of living kind of rises. But it's hard work having widely distributed private ownership, maintained.